Hello, Dr. Dyke Drummond here at the home of thehappymd.com in beautiful Seattle, Washington. Welcome to the latest episode of the Physicians on Purpose podcast. Tools so you can recognize and prevent your own burnout. Stories of burnout put to its highest and best use, and wellness leadership strategies. Everything you need to be a physician on purpose. Hello again, Dr. Dyke Drummond here at the home of The Happy MD in beautiful Seattle, Washington, with the latest edition of the Physicians on Purpose podcast. Today, we're in for a treat. We're going to talk about teaching medicine. We're going to talk about precepting. And I have with me Dr. Arthi Chawla and Dr. Winfred Frazier.
Hello.
Who are two folks who love precepting, love teaching actually residents. We're talking about residents today, right? Residents
Yes.
more than medical students. And what they're going to do is reveal to us something they've discovered, which is the 8 golden rules of precepting. Dr. Winfred Frazier.
Hello, everyone. What an introduction. So I'm Winfred Frazier. I'm a family medicine physician. I currently work in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I currently work at a family medicine residency program, teaching primarily residents, but also medical students, and also pharmacy residents as well. I'm originally from Texas, trained in Chicago, then traveled all over the place. Did a faculty development fellowship because I just miss being in that academic environment, and that's where I really honed in my teaching skills. And now I'm back in Pittsburgh doing what I love, teaching residents.
Dr. Arthi Chawla.
Hi, everybody. My name is Arthi Chawla. I'm a family medicine doctor. I'm originally from Rochester, New York. I went to medical school in New Orleans, Louisiana. I completed residency and a 1-year faculty development fellowship in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I spent 2 years on the West Coast doing locums work, and then I came back to Western New York, where I was faculty at a residency program for the last 5 years.
And our objectives for today are?
Our objectives today are to provide a guide on how to be an effective preceptor with the goal of training better physicians and improving patient outcomes. Dear listeners, I want you to think about a time in your life when an attending or a supervising physician made you feel terrible. What happened? What did that person say or do to make you feel terrible? Now, let's take a minute and think about the opposite. When an attending made you feel great, made you feel seen, heard, and safe. What was that like? What did that person say or do or not do to create this environment? If you think about these two situations, you can already see and appreciate the differences between effective precepting and not effective precepting.
And let's talk about effective precepting on today's episode. So real quick, from your perspective, why would somebody want to be a preceptor, and what is it about precepting that gives you joy?
Well, yeah, I'll start it off. I mean, I've always loved teaching. Even when I was in high school, I loved teaching kind of my fellow students. I continued that in undergrad when I was also teaching fellow students. And number one, I think it just shows that, like, hey, I just want to give back. I've had amazing teachers in my life. I can still remember my favorite teacher, my 3rd grade teacher, telling me, like, you're doing great, you can do this. And so, like, I've had these mentors in my life, and I just really want to give back, and seeing the spark in the learner's eye and seeing the growth over time, it's just like really rewarding. That's my favorite part.
Well, I think a lot of times when you're precepting, you're at the shoulder of your student, right? And you're doing the work together. That's kind of cool too. How about you, Arthi?
You know, Dr. Frazier, that is adorable. And I have the complete opposite story. I actually had no intention in going into teaching and academic medicine. It was really not until I was in my faculty development fellowship that I was actually co-precepting with Winfred one day. And I was like, this is fun. Like, this is really cool. Like, I get to work with, in that situation, we were working with residents and medical students, but it was just so much fun to work with them because, for the most part, residents and doctors are these just amazing talented, compassionate people. And I love being able to work with them to help develop them into amazing physicians in a kind and supportive environment. Like it doesn't have to be this horrible hazing environment that I think some of us have endured, but it can be not terrible. And I like creating a fun environment.
Well, and I think the proximity too gives you more of a relaxed atmosphere. If I said you're going to teach a class to 100 people, that
Mm,
would be a different anticipation and it
yes.
would be a different activity and it would feel different to deliver it. But if you're
Hmm.
saying you're going to walk around with this one resident and let them watch you and then you're going to let them take as much of the reins as you would like them to,
Hmm.
that's a very intimate, very personal, very
Hmm.
warm, can be a very warm and much less intimidating setting to be a teacher, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I have enjoyed working with residents more than medical students is because I love that longitudinal relationship that you develop with your residents. And my last job, I was there at a residency program for 5 years, and there were some people that I knew for 3, 4, 5 years, and it was just so beautiful to see them grow from these like little itty bitty baby interns to like these amazing attendings, and just love seeing them grow and succeed.
Yeah, they're on a rapid path at that point, that's for sure.
Hmm. Yeah,
It's very
absolutely.
collegial, right? I mean, like you're working with them so close as opposed to like a big auditorium with 200 students where there's like physical separation, right? Like you're working with them in different settings, inpatient setting, outpatient setting as well. So having that collegiality and having that relationship develop, like Arthi said, over years, it's super rewarding.
Excellent, excellent. So, along the way, you've discovered in your young careers, I know you're older than you look, but in your young careers, the 8 golden rules of precepting. Nail us with number 1. What's number 1?
All right, I'll take this. So number one, this is not about you. It is about the patient and it's about the learner. And so I think that oftentimes, as an individual, as a physician, as an attending, as an educator, we all have our own personal feelings and thoughts about everything in the world, right? But also the learner that we're working with has their opinions too. And oftentimes their opinion is correct. It may not be the same opinion that we share, but it's still correct. And I think that's the beauty about medicine is that like there's so many different paths that are correct that still take into account patient's preference, that still takes into account patient safety. And so I think it's really important to let the learner have that plan and have them develop it. And obviously giving feedback and kind of chiming in as necessary, but really make it about them and about the patient and not about you. So that's rule number one.
And I would say we all know and have had dogmatic professors that did it their way and it was about them. And those are the ones that suck.
Hmm. Hmm.
Sorry.
Yep.
And the other thing I'll say too is it's not about you, it's about the patient, it's about the preceptee, but it's also about fostering their skill at developing a relationship between the two of them.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Direct from the preceptee to the patient, how they manage and create that relationship.
Well, just really quick, and these are in no particular order. So just wanted to point that out. All right, go ahead.
All right. Golden rule number 2: show up. Literally, figuratively. It's so important to show up physically, first of all, making sure that you are visible, literally visible to your resident, because number one, it shows that you are committed to the residents learning, and it also helps to build trust. And on a very basic level, it's also about patient safety. If you show up an hour late to your shift, what's happening during that hour that you're not there? I mean, the residents could be doing who knows what, and
Or
it's
nothing.
just not or nothing. It's not good. But then when you are also physically there, it's really important that you are present. It's not your time. Like, I get that everybody has really busy lives and that we have multiple competing things that are competing for our attention. Oh, it's the whirlwind.
The
Now's
burnout
not the
wheel.
yes, now is not the time to be checking your email or returning the text messages or whatever. It's so important to show up.
And so let's give them a tool. What do you say?
I would love that.
We call it the squeegee breath, right? And the squeegee breath is a breath that you take consciously. And you say to yourself, with this breath, I'm going to let go of anything that doesn't need to be here right now. And you breathe up to the top of your head, hold it, 2, 3, then exhale to the tips of your toes. Hold it out, 2, 3. Now let your breathing resume itself. Smile and say, ah. And as you exhale, you let go of everything that doesn't need to be here and become present to everything that actually is.
Yeah. I think that's important because like as faculty, we have so many competing demands all the time that contributes to a lot of things, including burnout, which we will not talk about today. But I think just like it really helps just centering and just like refocusing that like we're here, to really teach. And this is our primary goal at this moment in time. So yes.
And the squeegee breath is actually an evidence-based research. I did the research. Single breath mindfulness technique if you use it with a trigger, meaning you pick an activity you would never not do between patients, and you use that activity as a trigger to take that breath and clear yourself. Simple example of triggers, and there are hundreds of them, is if you work in a closed door environment, every time you touch the doorknob and walk into a new room, turn the doorknob and walk into a new room, you can just take a pause to take a breath and exhale. By the way, it works great to start and end your team huddles. And it works great to calm down patients, by the way. What I typically do is I put my hand on their upper arm and I say, well, Mavis, it's great to see you again. And I know this isn't the happiest day of your week when you have to come see the doctor. So why don't we just take a big deep breath and just let go of anything that doesn't need to be here right now. And if you do that with your patients, they will go with you. And if you do it with your patients a couple times in a row and you forget on the third time, they're going to say, hey, what about that breathy thing? It's actually a technique. The squeegee breath is actually a technique that goes viral when you introduce it into the workplace.
Absolutely. And it's definitely something that I have done with my residents, especially since, a lot of times they're running in from, maybe they're coming from inpatient and they're coming here and they have like all these things all over the place and, they're frantic. I'm like, okay, resident A, let's take a deep breath. Okay, let's take a nice deep breath and let's go of everything that has happened today and let's center ourselves right now.
And if you
And
really want them to center themselves, get them to do flutter lips. There, that's it. Now let's do this. This is spontaneous. I didn't plan to do this, but we now have our program sponsor. Our program sponsor is 1 Minute Mindfulness Training from thehappymd.com, which is the entire program that teaches the squeegee breath training and includes guided imagery for relaxation, chair yoga techniques, all sorts of stuff. It's a complete mindfulness training that's meant to fit into the workday of a busy physician. Like I said, squeegee breath is one breath. I'm going to put the link down in the notes for this show, and you can go take a look at 1 Minute Mindfulness and see if you want to enroll in the program. So let's see.
We're at number 3.
Yeah. I don't even think I can do flutter breath, but I'll practice that later. So
I'll help you with that.
thank you. Appreciate you. See, you educate me on all things medical and non-medical.
Likewise.
Number 3, treat others like you want to be treated, which sounds like another golden rule that people are familiar with. And don't be a jerk. So it's kind of a combo. Rule number 3. I think it's really important to realize that, residents are going through a lot, right? It's a really difficult job. There's a lot of things going on in their minds. They have a lot of things they have to do, not just like right there seeing the patient, but they might have to go back to the hospital. They might be on call that night. And you would think that medical education is like better or like easier since we trained, but it's not. I would argue it's almost worse. So I think just like keeping that frame of mind when you're working with that resident, being patient with them. I know that Arthi is going to talk about kind of feedback later on, but
Mhm.
just coming from a place of understanding, patience, and grace to the residents, and realize that they're learning. Right, this is a training environment; they're still learning, and they really trust you to have their
Yeah.
back and to educate them. And so that's kind of what this rule encompasses.
Right on. And I'm going to take it even farther, a little bit farther down
Do
the
it.
road. Keep going. You're on number what, 4 now?
Yeah, that was number 3, and I'm going to dive into number 4. All right. So, golden rule number 4: allow your students to come up with their own plan and ask them why. As Winfred said, this is a training and learning environment. It is not you taking a multiple choice test. Okay, the
Yay.
resident is not telling you a question stem, and it's not for you to answer. It is for them to become a competent physician. So when they're giving you the spiel and the story of the patient, allow them to develop their own plan, because that's what it's like in the real world. Again, it's not a multiple choice test. It is real life. And they have to learn to grow and function on their own.
It's interesting too that the plan is one that has to affect the actual actions of the patient. I can,
Yes.
I can have the plan, but it doesn't count unless I can create a relationship in which they're empowered to and held accountable to executing on the plan.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Number
That's really
5.
hard to know. That's really hard to know until they come
Course.
Number
back from
5.
follow-up and you're like, "Oh, did they do what we talked about?" And, number 5, listen. Listen. It's very important to do this. It's one of the basic things that we have, one of our senses, our ears to listen. So, I think it's, like, very common, when a resident is talking to us about our plan that Arthi mentioned in the previous rule, that we just, like, jump in and be like, "Okay, what did they say with this? Like, I recommend this. Okay, like this is, it's like it's a back and forth. Like, I'm like dodging jabs back and forth. And so I think it's I think it's important to like really let them like talk and speak. And I mean, I think we do that with patients too. I think there's some studies that say like just let the patient speak uninterrupted for 60 seconds and you get so much information in those 60 seconds and then you could kind of like dive into your questions. We want to know what the residents and our learners are thinking. We want to know their frame of mind. We want them to be able to kind of like talk through their plan. And so really important just to kind of sit back. Maybe while you're listening, take those deep breaths like we talked about earlier, link below, and then chime in. So listening, I know it's very basic, but it's really important. And I've talked to residents so much, and they're like, I just really appreciate that you let me get through my plan. So
Yeah, it's impossible to speak when you're inhaling. So taking a breath is a good starting point.
so true. Physiologically, it's impossible,
Number
Oh, yeah.
6.
plus or minus.
Rule number 6: meet your learner where they are. It is very important to do this if you want to help them set them up for success. For example, you would not give your car keys to a 4-year-old and tell them to go drive the car, pick up your groceries, and come home. It's just, I mean, it's silly, but if you think about it, and then they come home or they can't do it and you get mad at them. It's like that's just silly. Like you wouldn't do that to a kid. It's kind of the same idea with a resident, like or any learner. Like you wouldn't expect a first year resident to have the same skills as a third year resident or as an attending. So it's really important to meet them where they are and then don't get mad at them if they're unable to perform at a different level than what you expected.
And what do you do with your emotions when you realize that perhaps the resident don't know shit?
Ooh, lots of
Is this
deep
another deep
breaths.
breath?
Well, I
Lots.
So
would I
many
would
deep
encourage you
breaths.
to I would encourage you to start with that. And you might want to say something like, "Well, Ben, isn't this discomforting? I bet you're uncomfortable right now. I certainly am.
Yeah.
Are
Naming that
you
discomfort, right?
open to some feedback?"
Oh, Dyke, you made a good point, but we're actually going to get into it later about
Okay.
feedback.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll dive into number 7. We're so
Ooh.
close. Look up things that you don't know. So obviously, you know, maybe from the learner perspective, they think that educators, we know everything and we're just like encyclopedia of knowledge, but obviously that's not the case. And so when our learners ask us questions and we don't know, I think it's really important to be honest, number one, that
I
like,
don't
hey,
know.
I don't know. Be vulnerable, right? But along with that, saying like, hey, let me look this up, or let's look up this together, and
Hmm.
let's find resources together that we can answer this question. I think that number one, you admit vulnerability because
Hmm.
I think like there's so much pressure on residents and learners to know as much as possible. So when they're like, "Oh, one of my mentors, one of my faculty don't know this," like, okay, like they're human, but like, but they want to teach me and they want to teach me how to look things up in the future and these amazing resources that are on our fingertips. So I think that's really important, just to show that like, hey, we don't know everything. We want to learn too. We're learning
Hmm.
all the time also. And hey,
Hmm.
you can teach us. It's not just a
Yes.
unilateral teaching situation. Like I
Yeah.
learn from residents all the time.
Yeah. Same.
So exactly. So I think that's really important to talk about things that be honest of what we don't know, look up things together. It's so important.
Thank you, Winfred. I want to add to point number 7 about looking things up when you don't know. I think it's also really important to model that sort of behavior for your residents. You are never, ever, ever going to know everything, and it's foolish to think that you would. And a doctor who does not know his or her limitations, in my opinion, is a dangerous doctor. And so you want to teach that if they are getting to a point where they don't know something, look it up, ask for help. And again, at the end of the day, going back to point number 1, it's not about you, it's about your patient and it's about the learner.
And in situations where you don't know, it's important not to be the bully teacher, right? And
Yeah.
shame them, right?
Right.
Mm-mm. No one's got
And
time for
Yeah.
that.
and I would say watch out who's got the monkey, okay? So anytime you take on answering a question, you've got the monkey on your back. So one of the ways I would suggest that you address the majority of these incoming questions. Wow, Chuck, you know what? I don't know the answer. That's a great question. Why don't you look that up and teach us next rounds and put the responsibility back on them? Because there'll be a
Mhm.
time, and you've all been here. This is one of the things that I enjoyed most about being a family doc. Wow, I've never seen anything like this before. I don't have no idea what this is. When I'm by myself out in my practice, what am I going to do? Right. And
Look it up.
that's the habit of admitting that you don't know what's going on and having a way to figure out what your next step is when you're not a preceptee anymore and you don't have a faculty member on your right shoulder, right?
Mhm. Absolutely.
Follow through. I mean, I still remember some of my amazing mentors, and I keep them on my like my shoulder. I'm like, what would that doctor do? And that does sometimes help me actually.
Yep,
S-
yep.
Sometimes I ask, what would Winfred do?
Same. Or what would Arthi do?
You can always, when you're stumped, you can always point out, what a great question. I
Yeah.
wonder how you'll figure out the answer to that.
Mhm.
Where do you think you'll start? The other thing that's going on too is there's two learners in this dyad. There's one learner who's learning how to be a clinician, and there's another learner who's learning how to teach.
Yeah.
Mm.
Don't forget the patient. The patient's also learning. The triad.
It's a
They're in there
Absolutely.
triad.
too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Right on.
All right. Number
All
8,
right.
Arthi.
Number 8. So this is feedback. Reinforce what was done well and correct in private any mistakes that were made. Remember, your learners are not psychic. If they're doing stuff and it's done well, but if you don't tell them, they're not necessarily going to keep doing that because they don't know if it was done well. On the other hand, if they didn't do something well and you don't correct them, in a timely manner, they're going to continue to make those mistakes down the road. So, feedback, especially in a timely manner, is very critical for helping to develop your learners into competent physicians.
Right
Like,
on.
yeah, and feedback is teaching, right? So feedback and
Mhm.
teaching, I feel like that they go together and they have to go together, right?
Hmm.
So completely agree.
Absolutely. There has been many times that I have asked my residents for feedback, or and especially ones that I have developed a relationship with, especially if I've known them for, 2, 3 years, where I'll pull them aside and I'll say, "Hey, Chuck, what, as your preceptor, what are some things that I'm doing well that I can continue to do? And what are some things that I can improve on?"
Right. Yeah, I feel like we could have a whole session dedicated to feedback because it's just so much and so important, and I've seen it go terribly wrong, and I'm like, oh, um,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think that's really important to emphasize, like, when you're giving feedback, number one, make sure that like the learner is ready to receive that feedback,
Yes.
right? Make sure that you give feedback, constructive feedback alone, right? And just make sure that, like, again, like we said earlier, you know, be be nice. Don't be a jerk. Like, we're just like going back to these rules. Like, just follow all the rules, and you'll be fine.
Well, and back in the day, I'm 66. I actually graduated from medical school in 1984 and my residency in 1987. But back in the day, back way before residency work hour restrictions, right? And back beyond me, a lot of faculty members prided themselves on how much of an a-hole they could be. You think this is bad? You should have had Dr. Black's class in physiology back when I was a boy, right? And they always justify it by, well, that's the way I was taught. That's the way I was brought through. You guys don't know anything about what it was like, right? And I see a lot less of that these days, but you'll still see holdouts like that who think they're supposed to
Hmm.
beat on you and shame you when you don't know the answer. And that just creates a learner who's afraid of the
Yeah.
learning experience,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
traumatized
Absolutely.
by it in some cases.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
we've all had that happen to us, and I really tried not to do that, saying like, "Back in my day," or yeah, it's just like I I feel like it's just never helpful to the resident to say that, like, never.
Oh,
So
it
I
was never
really
done
do
because it
that.
was helpful. It was because everybody was traumatized. I mean, have you ever researched it? And dear listener, we're talking about training residents. Have you ever researched the history of the development of residency education?
I actually have not.
It all goes back to a handful of Austrian drug addict surgeons in the late 1800s. And Osler and Halsted brought it to the United States. They were drug addicts too. And it was absolutely
Okay, oh, great use of
an abusive apprenticeship. And if you research it, it is a very deep and nasty and dark history. And I would say that there was some humanity and some rationality injected into it in 2003, 2004, when we put work hour restrictions on residency programs. But if you've never researched the history of residency education and the Austrian drug addict, it's quite a story. Quite a story.
Yeah, that sounds terrifying.
I'm not exaggerating either. Okay, cool.
That
Are we on number 9 yet?
We're done. There was 8 rules and we got through all 8
Oh,
of
we
them.
got through them all?
yeah,
Okay,
Yes.
we're
cool.
good.
So let me chime in from my perspective as a teacher who
Please
teaches a
do.
different format. So I consider myself, I started out as a coach, right? I got certified as an executive coach and I started a coaching practice at thehappymd.com back in 2010. And I have several thousand hours worth of coaching experience with a whole bunch of doctors. I was a writer first, publishing blog posts, then a coach, and then a trainer. And I've actually trained 40,000 doctors and our principals at this point in time. And just a couple quick things. Golden rule, treat somebody how you would want to be treated. That probably puts you on safe ground for not being a jerk. But
Probably.
as you work with somebody over time, what you'll begin to recognize is their learning style.
Yes.
There are visual learners, there are auditory learners, there are kinesthetic
Mhm.
learners. And
Mhm.
that style will give you the ability, once you recognize that style and get used to that person, will give you the ability to practice the platinum rule, which
Ooh.
is teach them and treat them the way they want to be treated. Because
Ooh.
they're
Like
not
that.
you. They're not you.
That
And
is
Right.
true.
they probably have personality aspects and learning styles that is different than yours.
100%.
And
It's also like know your audience,
Mhm.
right? Like
Mhm.
I love that. Yeah.
Oh, and
Similar concept.
that's the difference between teaching from the stage is you have to teach in a way that brings everybody in the room into play. So you have
Mhm.
to use multiple styles at once.
Yeah.
The second thing I'll say is that in my experience as a family doc, my confidence as a family doc was not that I could figure out what everything was. I knew I couldn't. And I
Right.
found that exciting. It drives a specialist absolutely crazy because they want to
Yeah.
master this puzzle piece and always know the answer to the question. But we as primary care doctors, it's like, wow, I've never seen this before. This is awesome, right? I
It's
have no
true.
idea what to do. And then
True.
what we do is we use the power of our ability to create a relationship
Yeah.
where we know the patient, we're going to tell the patient what to expect. And if this, or this happens, come back and see me. We know they will come back and see us
Right.
because we have that relationship, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's the power of primary care is to be able to quickly build a relationship of trust and transparency so they will come back and give you that second
Mhm.
and third and fourth shot at an
Yeah.
undifferentiated, mysterious disease, right?
Mhm. 100%.
Yep.
Yeah, same thing with precepting. Building that trust with the learner is something that's super important. And that obviously happens just over time.
Mhm. One of the things that has always been really important to me, um, is being approachable and creating a supportive learning environment, like you were saying, that's not traumatic and not scary for the learner. And the reason I do that is because I don't want my students to be scared to ask me a question,
Right.
especially if it's going to impact patient care. You
Right.
know, I'm sure everybody can think of that time where they had a question, but they didn't want to ask, attending A because they didn't want to get yelled at. And so they end up just guessing for the patient's sake. And who knows if that's correct. And that's not what I wanted to happen. I want people to ask me questions. And because at the end of the day, it's not about me, it is about the patient and it's about the learner.
Yep.
I think you're able to do that, Arthi, and Arthi,
Thank you.
has won, precepting awards. I think because you're so relatable. You're relatable and you're vulnerable, and the learners really appreciate that, and you're honest. And that's why the learners relate to you so much. So,
I mean, likewise, Winfred, like you are genuine, you're real, you're approachable, and you have also won teaching awards from your residents. And so it's important. And like in Dyke, me and Winfred have precepted together. And so we can see how people approach us
just last week,
as a
we precepted
just
together.
last week. We actually did precept last week.
Yeah.
um Whereas like somebody who's intimidating, the residents are not going to be as motivated to speak up.
Right.
And one of the things that I've found is useful as a teacher of teachers
Mm,
is to, at some point in time when your trust level is high enough, to give feedback to the fledgling teacher about
mm,
their energy, the energy that they project with their resting face. So, dear
mm.
listener, if you're on YouTube right now and you can see Arthi and Winfred's faces, look at these. Look at these punums. Check them out. Check them out.
Ooh, I love that you said punums.
Friendly, open, smiling. I
Such a
I
Shano punum.
I wish, yeah, Shana is German for beautiful. So um, if you don't have a resting, friendly, and inviting face, it's important to know that
Mm,
because what will happen is you'll often be misperceived as being perhaps stern and perhaps a disciplinarian when you aren't holding that energy in your heart. It just sits on your resting face. And so as a teacher, I think it's really important, especially as a teacher that's precepting shoulder to shoulder, to let
Mm-hmm.
the people you're training to be trainers know about their resting expression and help
Mm-hmm.
them modify it if it's necessary. This right here, get that little Botox between your eyebrows, kind of a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And
You
to
don't
build
have it,
off.
Winfred.
I'm just checking, just making
No, you're
sure.
good. You're good.
I don't.
Right on. Well,
To
there we
build
have
off
it. Go ahead. Go ahead, Arthi.
what I was to build off of what you were saying, now I do want to rewind just a little bit and remind our dear listeners that remember, residency teaches you how to be a competent doctor, but it doesn't necessarily teach you how to be an effective teacher. Now, some people just get it. And as soon as they're out of residency, they are phenomenal doctors, they're phenomenal educators. I'm not one of those people. And I actually ended up doing actually, both Winfred and I did additional training on how to be effective educators. So we both did faculty development fellowships, which is a whole separate um, time dedicated to learning how to teach. I mean,
Train
I
the
did it
trainer.
yeah, exactly, training the trainer. And so one of the many reasons we wanted to do this is because we understand that this is not intuitive. It's just not. And to have that sort of feedback of what exactly you were talking about, Dyke, somebody pointing out to you what you're like, giving you feedback on how you are teaching is super important. And it is way easier when you have somebody who you trust, who's like sitting right next to you, who can do it for you. Like Winfred has given me tons of feedback on my precepting style, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, and sometimes if you're looking for VAK, which is visual auditory kinesthetic learning styles, they can cue you by the words they use. Well, that looks like this. How does it look to you? That's a visual. That's a
Yeah,
right. That doesn't
that's
sound right.
right. Exactly.
That's auditory, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, so a lot of times what it is an act as you begin to dive deeper into your relationship with your mentee, it's about mirroring, the classic mirroring that you would do with a patient. You might
Mhm.
gently, on a short time delay, mirror their posture. You would
Mm,
use the
mhm.
words that they use back to them, and you know that you're in their channel when you do that. Simple things like that.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Right on. So there we go, everybody. 8 golden rules of precepting, sponsored today by 1 Minute Mindfulness. I just looked it up. It's got 17 CME credits in it too. I'll put a link down below the frame. And this has been Dr. Arthi Chawla, Dr. Winfred Frazier on the latest edition of the Physicians on Purpose podcast. Until we see you on the next podcast, keep breathing. Have a great rest of your day.